okay, you can dig a canal, but at the same time, they're surveying their house lots, they're laying out their fields, they're planting their crops, they're building the meeting house, they're calling their minister, they're figuring out their rules and regulations. They're doing everything that they need to do to survive in the wilderness when there are fewer than 30 families in town. So it seems to many people, and me included, that it seems incredible that they should be able to do this excavation for 3/4 of a mile to bring this waterway about.
First of all, thank you for coming out on a Wednesday evening in the summer to hear about a power canal from the 17th century. We can already tell these are our people. So who has not been to the museum before? This is your first time in the museum. Excellent. Welcome. This is a museum of the industrial working class. There's a lot of talk right now about reindustrialization in America and what do we make in America and manufacturing in America. Well, it started here at scale first with Francis Cabot Lowell's mill that was on this site. And so for 200 years of industrial manufacturing and the building of the industrial working class, we have something to say about that. So we think our relevance right now is really important. It's also really important to bring you kind of these stories of history that are curious and fascinating, but really speak to the way that innovation and technology has changed the way that we live and work. And so that's why I'm really interested to go back to the beginning of power canals here. Judy is our speaker today, Judy Neiswander. Neiswander, sorry, Neiswander. With a name like Guerrero, I get that. So Judy's book is also available online and also on our merch store out by the desk. So tonight, I would love to welcome up, without further ado, Judy. Come on up.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that nice introduction. It's thrilling to see so many people here who are actually interested in the Mother Brook Canal. I have to admit that until I moved to Dedham, I had never heard of the Mother Brook Canal, but once I got involved in the Dedham Historical Society Commission, and my friend here, Dan, brought his desire to get it onto the National Register, we began to work on it, and I learned that it was a fascinating topic. So Mother Brook is a waterway, 3.5 miles long, that connects the Charles and Neponset rivers in Dedham. It was constructed between 1639 and 1641, 3 years after the initial settlement of Dedham, at a time when there were fewer than 30 families living in town. What I'm going to talk about today is how this waterway came about and what the early industries were that developed along the banks of Mother Brook. First, a little orientation for you who are sitting there thinking, I know where Dedham is. It's sort of over there. So it's down there. It abuts Boston. It's to the southwest. It is today a little area of over about 10 square miles with a population of about 25,000. It's a bedroom community for Boston. But where was Dedham in the Atlantic world of the early 17th century? Well, this is a section of the earliest map drawn, engraved, and printed in North America from 1677. And it shows that I have circled Dedham and Concord because those were the earliest inland towns. So the first land grants by the legislature away from the coast. Dedham to the south, of the Charles River conquered to the north of the Charles River. And Boston, you see down there, is just settled on the little isthmus that was originally Boston. Now, the Concord grant originally was 6 square miles, but the wily proprietors of Dedham asked for everything south of the Charles River. And the legislature said, oh, sure, take it all, take it all. So the original extent of the Dedham grant went all the way down to Rhode Island. So it contained towns that are now Westwood, Dover, Walpole, Wakefield, that gradually developed on their own and seceded off from Dedham. But Dedham was the mother town of the South Shore. Now, I'm happy to tell you that the 17th century is still alive and well in Dedham. And there are 3 notable artifacts of that period that still survive today. One is the town records. So Dedham is one of the very few towns that has a continuous, unbroken sequence of town records starting from the earliest days of settlement. In fact, even before they moved to Dedham, the proprietors of Dedham started keeping records and have been keeping records ever since. These have been transcribed, they've been digitized, they're freely available online. You can just Google early records of Dedham and it'll come right up. Unfortunately, the records don't necessarily answer all our questions. They don't always tell us everything we want to know. For example, you would think from the town records that Dedham was settled entirely by single guys. There is, other than births and marriages, which are recorded, there is not a whisper of the lives of women and children, unfortunately. Okay, so the earliest town records are, of course, also a great resource for people who are doing research on early American history, and they have been delved into again and again for that purpose. Okay, so that's the first artifact. The second artifact is, of course, the Fairbanks House. How many people here have been to the Fairbanks House? Okay, good for you. Some of you live in Dedham, and I'm not sure you count. The Fairbanks House was built in 1637, not everything you see here, only the small section closest to us with a hipped roof. It is the oldest timber frame house in North America. You can go there. It is still owned by the Fairbanks family. It is a house museum. You can go there during the summer and you can see the original fireplace where they cooked their meals. You can see the hex signs that have been etched into the timbers to keep away bad spirits. It is a magical place. So I urge you all to go there and to see it. And third, there's Mother Brook. Mother Brook is arguably the oldest power canal in North America. And here you see it winding its way through the woodsy sections of Dedham. It does not look today the way it did in the 17th century. It has been reworked again and again by the DCR, by the MDC. There was extensive flooding in the 50s. They had to change it. So therefore it is not, since nothing remains of the 17th century power canal, with one exception, that's why it cannot be on the National Register. It does not have enough of its original, what they call integrity, originality to it. But it still runs on its original course. So it is still in the same place as the original Mother Brook Canal. So how did this canal come about? And I use canal and waterway interchangeably. Well, the town was settled, much like other New England towns. It was settled in 1636 by 18 men and their families who arrived. They arrived from various parts of England, and they met in Watertown. They spoke together, they liked each other, and they decided that they would form a community together. And they drew up a covenant to form a like-minded settlement where they could live together according to their interpretation of the Puritan faith. Now, of course, I have to say the terror of doing a talk on the first 200 years of Dedham is that there are no images. So I have to make do with later. And I like this painting. It's from the end of the 19th century, as you can tell, about Puritans going to church. I think the clothing is generally correct. I mean, I would imagine people looked pretty much like this. But what sort of I find moving is the sort of wariness of the group. And if I try to imagine what it must have been like to come around that last corner in your canoe, having paddled 17 miles from Watertown, and come to the place where you are going to live the rest of your life, and it is a wilderness, I can imagine that there, on one hand, there would be feelings of enormous joy that we have made it at last. This is our promised land. But also feelings of, oh my goodness, what have we gotten ourselves into? And I think that image expresses it quite well. So they set about building their community. They built little houses. This is one in Plymouth Plantation. They may have looked like some of the early dwellings in Dedham. And they set about feeding themselves. Now, they came in March, so they knew that their crops would not be ready for many months. But they had brought grain with them. Millet, rye, wheat, barley, grains that all of which needed to be ground before they could be cooked and eaten. You can't metabolize unground grain. But they were prepared for this. They had brought with them small hand millstones, and miraculously, I think, one of these survives in the Dedham Museum and Archive, and here it is. So I should have said perhaps there are 4 terrific artifacts from the 17th century. So it's a small stone about this big. The wooden encasement of it was, of course, made in the New World. The hole in the middle is where you would put the grain, and you would put a stick in one of the smaller holes, and then you would go around and around and around. And the ground the ground grain would fall out through the hole in the front into a bowl or something. Now, if you have to grind the grain for 3 meals a day, it's a very time-consuming and laborious, and not to mention tedious, task. But the only other alternative was to take it to a grist mill. Well, they had left, along with civilization, they had left the closest grist mill back in Watertown. And Watertown, as I said earlier, was 17 miles away. So there's little Dedham up there, there's Watertown, and there is the long, wiggly route back to Watertown, where you have to take it, and then you'd have to wait in line, and then you'd have to get it back, and then you'd have to put it back in the canoe, and anyway, it's an extremely cumbersome process. And of course, they quickly realized they needed their own grist mill. Well, one of the proprietors, the initial settlers were called proprietors, said, I'll build that grist mill. And that was Abraham Shaw. And he started out building a grist mill on the Charles, but within 2 years he was dead. And the grist mill was hardly begun, if at all. But by this time, the settlers had figured out a couple interesting facts. One was that the Charles makes this little jog down here. Well, that places it, that's its closest proximity to the Neponset River over there. So this is the Neponset, this is the Charles, and this is what is going to become Mother Brook, joining the two. The Charles turned out to be too sluggish, and so they began thinking about whether or not they could connect the Charles and the Neponset, because fortunately, they're here, about here or so, there was a brook. Not a very strong brook, a small brook, not strong enough to turn a wheel, but it didn't flow into the Charles, it flowed into the Neponset. So they thought, aha, there may be possibilities here. And so, according to the early town records, on the 25th day of March, 1639, they decreed an order that a ditch shall be made at the common charge, in other words, everyone will pay for this and contribute, through purchased meadows unto ye East Brook. And this is a map showing what they had to dig through. So the first section up here is kind of, I'll show you other slides, it's kind of softish, marshy meadows. Down here is swamp, and then the source of the East Brook is over there. So the length of the area they had to excavate was 3/4 of a mile. So, okay, you can dig a canal, but at the same time, they're surveying their house lots, they're laying out their fields, they're planting their crops, they're building the meeting house, they're calling their minister, they're figuring out their rules and regulations, they're doing everything that they need to do to survive in the wilderness when there are fewer than 30 families in town. So it seems to many people, and me included, that it seems incredible that they should be able to do this excavation for 3/4 of a mile to bring this waterway about. So it raises two questions. First of all, how did they figure this out? And second, how did they accomplish it? Well, this is a map of England, and the part in red is East Anglia. 60% of all the Puritan immigrants to the New World came from East Anglia. And it's an area that has a very long history of manipulating water levels through extensive systems of dikes and drains in order to increase the amount of arable land. And this other map of this section shows you everything in gray that you see there is swamp. And that little red dot is Dedham. And Dedham is surrounded by place names like Framingham, Billerica, Malden, Needham Market. You see a pattern here? So just before the people who would become the first settlers of Dedham left their homeland, all this area up here, the great fens along the Ouse, had just been drained. So the construction of a waterway and the calculation of elevation and drop and flow was probably something that they were already familiar with. The question remains of what the land was like that they had to dig through. Now, this is the earliest photograph we have of the Mother Brook Canal at the Charles River. It was taken around 1900. And as you can see, it looks rather marshy. There are three great historians of Dedham. And they're all called, just to confuse you, Erastus Worthington. Now, Erastus Worthington, the youngest, wrote the history of Mother Brook, which is the sort of foundational document for learning about Mother Brook. And he says, writing in 1900, well, you see, it's so marshy over there. It probably didn't take them that long. I'm not quoting him directly, but that was the gist of it. Now, his grandfather, Erastus Worthington, the eldest, the first, who was born in 1772, may possibly have known the children of the original settlers, certainly the grandchildren of the original settlers. And he, writing in 1837, which is considerably closer to the source, writes, "The Charles River meadows have gradually arisen from an unbroken, impenetrable swamp, covered with fallen trees, and the greatest part of the time covered with water." And the early records of the town of Dedham from the 1630s mention frequently the need for clearing the swamp. Every man was to spend part of his time clearing the swamp. And when they didn't, when they sloughed off from their responsibilities because they had so much to do at home, they levied fines on people who refused to clear the swamp. So it's quite possible that at least some of the area they had to dig through looked a lot more like this. So what tools did they have? Well, by the time the settlers of Dedham arrived, the Great Migration of Puritans to the New World was already 20 years old. So people had written back letters saying, "Oh my gosh, we forgot this, but you be sure and bring it." So we do not have a provision list for the Dedham settlers, but recently a provision list for the Mayflower, believe it or not, has come to light, and this is it. And you see that they bring with them shovels and spades and broad axes, broad hoes, narrow hoes, hand saws, augers, hammers, casting shovels, a great pail, all kinds of things that would be extremely useful in digging a canal. Now, the tools that they brought, like the hoes and the spades, they brought only the iron heads of the tools, and all the wooden handles would have been made in the New World. I think they also had oxen. There is an ancient yoke in the collection of the Fairbanks House, and there are several references in the early records before the completion of the canal about bullocks and working cattle. Working cattle, i.e. not cattle that are bred for meat or milk, but working cattle. Now recently, the engineer Bob Timmerman, in an ingenious article in the newsletter of the New England chapter of the Society for Industrial Archaeology, reverse engineered the construction of the Mother Brook Canal. And considering how much water it would take to turn the wheel of a grist mill, he calculated that a ditch 5 feet wide and 2.5 feet deep would be sufficient to turn the wheel. It possibly, there are many unknowns in all of what they did, but it might possibly take 5 men working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, about 2.5 years to complete this waterway. And if they used bullocks, if they had good tools, it might have taken them less time. At any rate, we know that in about 2.25 years, the canal was finished. Because not that the town records tell us anything about this, because they don't, because you really want to know more, but they don't say. What they say, rather, as a side issue, is in 1641, so now a little over 2 years after the first order was given, they order the construction of a cartway to our water mill. So apparently the grist mill was completed. The grist mill was actually constructed by a millwright named John Elderkin, who wasn't interested in being a miller, he was interested in building things. So he was given land, and he sold the land, and he moved on and built meeting houses and other important buildings throughout New England. So the grist mill probably looked much like this. This is not an image of the first grist mill. This is an image of the second grist mill, farther up the river. We don't know what the first grist mill looked like. But these early buildings, they lasted like iron. They were built of old growth wood. They were built completely with joinery, without any nails, so they would stand, it almost seems like forever. Well, the Fairbanks House, for example. So by the middle of the 19th century, they were looked upon as sort of romanticized, nostalgic survivors of an earlier, better day, and artists took up depicting them. And one of them was the Dedham artist Henry Hitchings. So this is his view of a waterway, of the grist mill further up the river, the second grist mill. And I just want you to cast your eye over these little buildings here with the big tall chimney to the right, because I'm going to come back to those later when we talk about early manufacturing. So what were the early industries of Mother Brook? Well, it didn't take people long to figure out that a power canal could be used for other purposes than turning the water wheel of a grist mill. And a water wheel could be used for other purposes. So this is the earliest map we have. It's from 1795, which is not that early, but it does show some of these early manufacturing sites. So these are numbered in the sequence in which the sections of the canal were utilized. I'm not going to go into the whole privileges thing. So the first grist mill was here. There was another industry here, what they call on the map a leather mill. So the second grist mill that I just showed you is here, and down here there's a wire mill. So let's talk a little bit about the leather mill. A leather mill is a tannery. It doesn't involve a water wheel. Hides are soaked in water with substances that are called tannins. Often these are kinds of acidic barks of trees to make them pliable and rot resistant. The hair is scraped off. They're dried, and then they're used for a multiplicity of services. A purposes. As I say, it doesn't require a water wheel. It is kind of toxic, actually, but a necessary industry. There was a fulling mill on Mother Brook by 1682. So a fulling mill, fulling cloth, is an essential step in producing homespun fabric. The cloth is woven on a loom, spun, woven on a loom, and then you take it to the fuller, and he puts it in what looks like a barrel, but this is sort of a cross-section of the barrel. And the fabric is pounded by these stocks that are connected to the water wheel. It's a very simple mechanism. And they're pounded with soap and lye, and this scours and tightens the fabric, gets all the oils out, similar to felting. Some of you perhaps know what felting is. Okay, so the stocks beat the cloth, and the section behind the cloth you see is curved, and that requires the cloth to keep turning over and over and over, so it can be beaten up easily. There was also a sawmill. Now, actually, again, this is an incredible photograph, one of our earliest photographs from 1868 of the sawmill with the jolly sawmill owner sitting on a log in front. Here is now a photograph of the grist mill that I showed you a print of earlier. So it's the same location. So by 1700, there were sawmills. And a sawmill did require a water wheel, but it's an extremely simple device that could be, it's not really a machine. It has metal sections to it. I mean, it has a saw, which could be made by any local blacksmith. But otherwise, it's a wooden contraption that is operated by a water wheel that operates the saw and then at the same time pushes the log against the saw. Most of these, with the exception of the sawmill, which was a little bit of a new thing, everything I've talked to you about is an industry that would have been familiar to people in the Middle Ages. They were not new, they were not based on inventions, they were not mechanical, really. But in 1793, Dedham became the county seat of Norfolk County, and they built a beautiful courthouse, which has, I think, been much in the news in the last few months. And this attracted new men to town, people who were interested in science, who were interested in technology, and they were interested in more advanced manufacturing. So they began startups, I think is the best way to describe them. New little industries based on inventions. So one of them was a wire mill. Now, as I said earlier, there are no pictures, so I'm having to use the pictures that I can find, and the ones that I can find are from Diderot's Encyclopedia of 1751. So what you're seeing here is wire as it is made in Paris, not wire as it is made in Dedham. Do not think for a moment that there is any workshop in Dedham that had beautifully cut stone floors and beams and lovely glass windows. Those sort of sheds I pointed out next to the grist mill, that was the location for a number of these startup industries. So think Bill Gates in the garage is a better analogy. And they certainly weren't wearing nicely tailored frock coats. But wire was needed for needles and fish hooks, and particularly for carding paddles. So carding paddles is where you hand card the wool to line up the fibers, so then you can take the fibers off and they're all going in the same direction, and then you can start to spin them on the spinning wheel. And you see that it needs a lot of wire. But one of the biggest consumers of wire were paper mills. Now, paper at this time was made out of rags, as in rag paper. And they would take rags and then they would beat them into a pulp, and it would put them into a slurry of water and lime and sort of try to dissolve the fibers, and it would be a kind of disgusting pulp. But to get a single sheet of paper, you would take a frame the size of the sheet that you were going to make, you dip it into the pulp and raise it up, and then all the liquid would fall through the mesh that was at the bottom of the frame. So every single frame had to have a mesh. And every single piece of paper had to be made in a frame with a mesh, a wire mesh bottom. So you can see you need a lot of wire because you need a lot of paper, and it's disposable and you can't reuse it very easily. So there was just a continuous need for wire for paper mills. And you can see that these frames with the wire are back there piled up against the wall. In 1814, the wire factory failed, and a nail factory took its place. Again, this is a picture of the old way of making nails, which was by blacksmiths making one nail at a time. But in 1795, a new nail-making machine was patented that cuts nails from sheets of plate iron, sort of like cookie cutters. It was invented by Jacob Perkins of Newburyport, who also invented the refrigerator. So this is the great age of tinkerers and inventors. And then there was the copper rolling mill. This was built by Joshua Witherley, who was a coppersmith from Boston. In 1787, the legislature passed an act to create a state currency and to mint copper coinage. So think of this for a bit. Even for the first 175 years, there is no common coinage. So people traded either with barter, you give me your bushel of wheat, I'll give you my bushel of apples, or with coins from other countries. So Spanish doubloons, English tuppence, or pieces of coins, all of which, of course, had different valuations, and all of which would have to be carefully calculated at any point of sale. And it was, needless to say, extremely difficult. So Massachusetts decided that at least they would have a state currency, and they appointed Joshua Witherley the master of the mint. And Witherley built the mint in his backyard, which was the place where he would stamp the coins. But for completely reasons no one knows, he decided to make a rolling mill for the creation of the blanks for the coins in Dedham. Now, we have actually the record of his struggles with the legislature over this process, and it vividly illustrates the difficulty of starting up a new manufacturing enterprise in this new young country. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book. In May of 1787, Witherley represented himself as ready immediately to proceed. But by January of 1788, no coins had yet been minted. When the governor's council called him to account for his lack of progress, Wytherley reported that, first, as no blast furnace could be located that was able to cast the rollers, they had to be fabricated from wrought iron instead. Also, steel of a strength to withstand the force necessary to impress the coin's design could not be found of sufficient hardness. Much time had been additionally expended in training workmen in, quote, a business which has not been practiced in this country, unquote, only to discover that rolling copper wasted excessive amounts of labor and fuel. So the mill was then refitted to draw the copper through a trip hammer, although this too was delayed by the ice and snow of a severe winter. Once the factory was able to produce the rolled plates, the cost of transporting these plates to the mint in Boston turned out to be prohibitive. So in the end, the factory operated successfully only for a few months, and a very small number of coins were ever minted, 2 of which you see here, or I think the back and the front of one you see here. Wytherley was discharged from his position in January of 1789, and efforts by the individual states to coin money were soon overtaken by developments at the national level once the Constitution, ratified in June of 1788, established a national currency and a national mint. So here we are back at the same location, looking again at these little lean-tos where some of these early manufacturing startups were operating. So all of these early manufacturing efforts were small, extremely precarious, and often very short-lived. The nail factory. You would think the country would need nails, but it only lasted 4 or 5 years. Well, let's think about what if you were a nail maker. You would spend a lot of money to get the brand new machine, so you might be in debt already, and you start making nails and you think this is going to be great. Everybody needs nails. But your machine keeps cranking them out, and after a while, all your carpenter buddies, they've got their nails. They may have a lifetime supply of your nails, and their friends have your nails. And then maybe you've got relatives in Dorchester, or you've got relatives and friends in Brookline Village, and so you take some of your nails up there, and pretty soon they've got your nails. And then nobody needs your nails. You have saturated your market. So there were many obstacles to the creation of an integrated regional market economy. For one thing, the roads in Dedham, they were terrible. They were terrible throughout Massachusetts, throughout all of the colonies. They were rutted and muddy in spring and fall. They were often impassable in the winter. So, you know, if you really want to sell nails to somebody in Somerville, how are you going to get them there? That means you have to take them to Somerville and take your time, or hire someone, pay them a day's wages, what they wouldn't be making otherwise, to take them there for you. And you'd have no idea when they would arrive. Equally, you would have no idea when you could get raw materials for your operation. The most minimal there were new turnpikes, and the one between Dedham and Boston was chartered in 1802, but it wasn't completed until years later. And the most minimal transportation network within Dedham, that is a road between Dedham Center and the Mill Village, was not constructed until 1806. So transportation was a huge barrier. There's also no communication system. I mean, how are you going to source materials? How are you going to identify markets? That guy in Somerville, he may need your nails, but how's he going to find out about them? He doesn't read the sort of pretentiously titled Columbian Minerva newspaper that's published in Dedham. And there's no Boston Globe. There is no communication network. There is also no banking system. So how are you going to secure financial transactions at a distance between strangers? This was a face-to-face world. Well, all these challenges would be overcome by the last industry that would take hold on Mother Brook, and that would be the textile industry. And Dedham built textile mills like crazy. There are only 3 of them that I show you here. The earliest mills were family mills for spinning cotton thread. They had wooden machinery operated by children, as you see here. Samuel Slater's mill in Providence was operated by children as young as 6. They especially advertised for widows who had many children and were desperate. But the machines grew in size, the mills grew in size. The new machines were made of metal. It was too heavy for children. So these were operated by a new, previously untapped labor force, Yankee farm girls. Young women were freed from the tedium of spending hours and hours spinning by the new textile industry. And they flocked to mills to work for at least a few years because it was the first form of waged employment for women. During the Civil War, the industry changed to wool production. It grew and consolidated, and the enormous Merchants Woolen Mill bought up all the smaller mills and built this humongous plant up off of Bussey Street in an area that is now called Condon Park because it was torn down in the 30s, and now it's a vast playing field. And if they had kept it, it could be affordable housing, but they didn't. These gigantic mills were operated by immigrants, and they brought thousands of immigrants to the town of Dedham. Immigrants who changed the whole face of the community. But that, I'm afraid, is a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy.
You're welcome.
We live within walking distance of Condon Park. I would love to take a few questions. Even if we can hear you, just wait till I get with the microphone so we can record you for the...
Thank you. I've always been fascinated with the development and how they utilized as much energy as they could with waterways and canals and so forth. You had mentioned that initially the canal was 5 feet wide and a couple feet deep. And so I'd love to hear how they continue to develop and make that more powerful to be able to handle the great workload that eventually with all of the mills that were there.
Well, of course, we don't know exactly what the original, the dimensions of the original ditch. Bob Timmerman calculated that that's what it would take to turn a water wheel. What they dug, we don't know. But certainly it was enlarged over the years. New dams were built, and you know, again, it's hard to know because what's left is so changed. But it was certainly enlarged many times over the years.
So was the water that was going through the brook to power the mills, was it coming from the Charles River or Neponset?
It was coming from the Charles River.
I see. So did they use the Charles River at all for transportation?
Yes.
You know, to transport goods back to Boston?
Well, in the early days, I'm not sure how much transporting of goods they sent to Boston. Certainly by the time of the cotton mills and the woolen mills, there was the railroad, and there were proper roads and horses and, transportation like that.
I've been fascinated by the Mother Brook Canal for years, and I've always wanted to, though I don't know if it's possible, get a couple of kayaks and I realize there are different little waterfalls and blockages, and go down the whole thing. First of all, is that possible? Second question, at the time, did anybody navigate it with canoes either for recreation or logistical purposes? Or was it only ever a power canal?
No, there was a bathhouse there in the early 20th century. People certainly swam in the mill pond. One of the earlier 20th century industries was the Boston Envelope Company, and I'm told by old Dedhamites, of which I'm not one, that young people swimming in the pond would be tinted blue or yellow or pink by the dye used on the envelopes that was discharged into the pond. It doesn't seem to be possible to take a canoe down the whole route. Some of it is very shallow now, and the town does not own the banks of Mother Brook anymore. That's all now owned by the state. And I'm sure there are issues of liability and blah, blah, blah. So there is a walking path, and you can walk along much of it, but I don't think you can. And also, in some places, it's quite narrow, so I don't think you can canoe along it, as nice as that would be.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I've got a question about the lawyers. So I've done some reading on Mother Brook, and when they started taking water from the Charles to feed Mother Brook, the dam owners in Watertown basically sued because they took the water. Can you comment on that? I haven't cracked into it and was wondering if that has come up in your research.
The great water level controversy. I don't believe it was mill owners in Watertown. It was mill owners along the Charles River who, at one point, early on, in the late 18th, early 19th century, felt that too much water was going into the Mother Brook Canal, and it was robbing them of power for their water wheels. And so they consolidated into a corporation, and then the mill owners in Dedham consolidated into a corporation, and they negotiated back and forth, and they went to the legislature, and they came up with an agreement. And then for some inexplicable reason, the agreement was never filed. There is a section in the book about this, but I think there are others who deal with it better than I do. And at some point, you can tell me, when was the actual water level? It was to be 1/3 Mother Brook, and 2/3 of the water was to stay in the Charles, and there was a a foot put at the bottom of the entrance to Mother Brook that would determine this, and there is a mysterious hole drilled in a rock that none of us have been able to find that is supposed to be the level over which the water is not supposed to rise. But you can read more about it in the book. Yes.
I can comment on that based on my own research. In 1800, the mill owners on the Charles River brought suit against the mill owners on the Mother Brook. It took 24 years to settle the lawsuit before they finally had an agreement.
And that's the agreement that was never filed.
What?
That it was never entered, or there was some final step that was never taken.
Well, I've said I'm an engineer. I'm actually the guy that did the reverse engineering of the Mother Brook.
I know you are.
And I have said that all you need is a crew of laborers to build a dam and a power canal, some millwrights to build a water wheel, and maybe a blacksmith, and the best lawyers you can find.
All right, one more maybe.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting how the water flow from this canal gave birth to industry, and then as you described, industries got bigger and required more. I'm curious, how long did this last? That the flowing water was the primary source of power, and what replaced it?
Well, steam replaced it, sort of middle of the, well, no, before the Civil War. Steam replaced some of it, at least, perhaps not all of it, but very soon thereafter replaced all of it. And you start seeing, you know, drawings, landscape drawings of Dedham that have big smokestacks, you know, for the steam. It also increased the fire risk, unfortunately, but so I would say 1830s, 1840s.
Judy, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.